Hey, it's Jamie, and today I've got a software project story for you that is really ridiculous if you think about it, what happened. So I was working at this software consulting company, and while I was kind of in between projects, my boss at the Austin headquarters at that time asked me to help with a software project that was kind of in some trouble. And when I found out about the project, I was told that one of our guys that was working out there from the company I was working for was actually fired by the client. The client was pissed off and not happy with the work they were doing. So my boss asked me, why don't you meet with him and find out, why did he get fired, what really happened, and get ready to roll onto this project. So I met with him, and within talking to him, and in just a few minutes, he said, yeah, this client sucks, we're all miserable, we hate it. But he didn't really tell me why. We didn't have a lot of time. He couldn't go into a lot of detail, but I found out this client was in the high volume advertising space. So they did a whole lot of advertising online, and so I was told that this was supposed to be some sort of software project or solution that was really scalable and really designed sophisticated to deal with this huge volume of traffic. So the interesting thing was the client was this huge company, but they had brought us in to help them with this tiny company that was really just these two guys that were in their 20s that lived in Washington, D.C., and they had started up a little tiny startup that was bought by this big company. And this big company came to my agency for help with some performance problems they were having. Little did we know at the time, however, that the two gentlemen in their 20s didn't really want help from an outside vendor. So when I showed up on this project, the first thing I noticed right away was I was working with a couple other guys I'd worked with on another project before for my consulting agency, but when I showed up, they were all going out for drinks all the time. They were going out to lunch and stressed out. They were really, really miserable and hated the project, and they would basically get out of the building where this client was whenever possible to just try to blow off some steam. And so I couldn't really talk to anybody while I was sitting at the client, about what was going on. I didn't know what the politics was and why everybody was so frustrated. But I found out quickly that part of the reason everybody was so miserable on this project was these two guys in their 20s were second guessing every decision they made and basically disagreeing with them about everything. And here was a company that had brought us in. They're paying us a lot of money, but these two guys were not listening to them. And it was really frustrating to the people that I'd worked with that were already there for a long time. So the first thing I was asked to do was to do a proof of concept in HADOOP. Apparently, they were collecting gigs and gigs and gigs of advertising data every single day, and their existing system that they'd built in Microsoft.net wasn't scaling, and they couldn't figure out why. And one of them had a friend that worked at Twitter, and somehow he got the big idea that putting HBase or Cassandra or Mongo or some sort of document store in place was going to solve all their performance problems. So I started the proof of concept, but halfway through, me and another guy who had worked on a lot of other projects before, we realized there was no way that this was going to perform very well for them because their product let their customers slice and dice the data in a ton of different ways. And at that time, like Elasticsearch and some of the other big data technologies that let you do more sophisticated filtering and querying weren't really available. And so we got on the phone and we were trying to convince these two guys, look, HBase, Hadoop, all these technologies, they aren't going to really work well for this particular way that you're using the data. And they just didn't believe us. And we even went so far as to, we read Google's white paper on kind of how Google's search engine worked, because this data technology that they wanted us to use, the way that it indexed data was exactly the same as Google. And we showed them that in the white paper, it even explained the limitations of the search, and we tried to explain why it wasn't really a good solution for what they were trying to do. They weren't just letting their customers search, they were letting their customers do all kinds of advanced filtering. So after a while, we had loaded, maybe a month's worth of data into this platform, and we had a cluster up in the cloud. It was on Amazon Web Services, and it was still really slow. And they were telling us, well, it's slow because you haven't added enough data yet. If you add more data, it'll go faster. And I remember me and the other guy I was working with, we were just laughing so hard because we're like, what are you talking about? You don't add more data and something goes faster. And I think they just did not understand what they were doing when it came to the data layer of this application. Well, around this time, my agency was going through a really tough time in Austin. There wasn't a lot of technology work. And so over time, there were like 9 of us. Basically, every developer that was working for my consultancy here in Austin was all working at this one client. And about half of us were libertarian, maybe politically, and the other half were probably more liberal. And so when we were out on the floor at this client site, now remember, this was the headquarters downtown in Austin, but these two guys, they were actually in Washington, D.C. So they were always talking to us remote, but we had to actually work out on the floor floor with a whole bunch of other people at the parent company. And we were discussing politics and just various things about, software. And somebody overheard us and didn't like our political views and complained to HR. And the next thing we knew, there were all these emails being sent to our boss and saying we were being disruptive and disrespectful and people didn't want to hear what we had to say on the floor. So all of us were frustrated, and we really just kind of felt like, really, we're that irritating that nobody could just come up to us and talk to us? And we didn't think we were being that loud, but being consultants, sometimes you just have to do silly things because your client's paying you. So we stopped talking about politics, but we got to a point where anytime we'd say anything, HR would complain. I mean, basically we had to be like almost completely silent for whatever reason. The people at this parent company that had nothing to do with even the project we were on, they were just other people in other cubes. They really didn't like us. And so it got to a point where we would just show up every day and we would walk to, wherever we were sitting to do development. And here are 9 guys from my consulting agency. We're all sitting in the same area and we couldn't even talk to each other. It was the stupidest thing ever. We just had to chat. So let me bring it back around to when this project got really whacked out, which is we started looking at the code. And, if you've ever built any kind of web application, a lot of them have like a front end layer. You might have like a middle business logic layer, and then you've got a database layer. And if you have a product where there's a lot of data that's being collected, a lot of times performance can become a problem. And so the way that this existing company, these 2 guys had dealt with this performance problem, they had so much data they were collecting, but it was just a little bit at a time per person, was they had bought these $100,000 each hard drives that they were running in production. And there were I think 4 of them. So it was like $400,000 worth of hard drives to run this system. And so we started looking at it and we're kind of going, why are there these really expensive hard drives they're using? I mean, they're collecting a lot of data, but it wasn't like they were, Uber or Google or something. We couldn't understand. And we started looking at the code and we realized every time they pushed data to the database, before they would stick the data in a queue, basically like a waiting line along with other messages. But there wasn't just 1 queue, there were 3 queues. So they had all the data was going through all these queues, and the architecture of this app had become super complicated, and we couldn't figure out why. We were like, you should be able to just have your app call some code and it just writes it to the database. It doesn't make sense why you're having these performance issues. So eventually we convinced them to let us bring in a SQL master. He was a gentleman who had a ton of certifications, including the SQL Server Master certification. And he was somebody that, if you ever try to use Microsoft SQL Server database, it has a ton of different settings. And even if you're a developer like me who's been doing it for a really long time, there's some people that are just specialists. They know every little detail of SQL Server. So we had convinced these 2 gentlemen, why don't we bring a SQL master in and have him look at your system, and maybe there's something we can find that will get you some performance benefits. And at first they were like, no way, we don't want anybody looking at our database server. We know it better than anybody else. It's a waste of time. And so as the weeks went on, we just kept pushing and pushing till they finally let the SQL master in. Well, once the SQL master came in, he's looking at the database. And if you've ever used a database as a developer, you install it on your own machine, there's a thing called auto grow that's usually turned on by default. And all it does, it makes perfect sense, is it makes the size of the database file automatically grow as you add data to it. So you can kind of say, once it gets to let's say 50 megabytes, you can make it 50 bigger. And then once it gets to 50, you can make it 50 bigger. And this just, I don't want it to get too geeky, but this is pretty wild. This SQL master found out they had auto grow turned on in production, and you never do that with SQL Server, because if you turn auto grow on, what happens is once, let's say you're storing data in the database, once you hit a certain threshold of data in the database slows way down, stops new connections, has to completely restructure and grow itself, and then makes itself available again. Well, we found out their production database was regrowing itself every 30 seconds. So the reason they needed these $100,000 hard drives was because SQL Server was basically resizing and restructuring itself every 30 seconds in their production environment. So once we told them about this, as you can imagine, they were scared. They didn't want their boss to know. They didn't want anybody to know. And so they told the parent company they were having problems communicating with us. We didn't seem to be understanding the work they were asking us to do. And they needed a way to communicate more quickly with us. And what they asked the parent company was, we want to put a computer next to the developers, the consultants, with a webcam on it that can just be pointed at them. And, you know, if they have a question, they can just ask us and they don't have to chat with us. And it was total BS. It was an intimidation technique. They wanted to watch over us and make us feel uncomfortable. And boy, did it. There was about a week that went by where every day I would show up, walk in front of this computer with this webcam and sit down. And I'm sitting there with, you know, again, 9 other guys. We're all working on this project. And we all know there's this webcam pointed at us that's streaming us all live to Washington, D.C. to these 2 guys. So luckily, after about a week, they just sort of walked into the camera and were like, yeah, we're not going to do this anymore, guys. And they just turned it off because it was useless. You know, if we had a question, we usually just emailed them or chatted them, and we knew this was just a way to basically get back at us because they didn't like that we were bringing up things that they didn't really know. So as the project went on, the relationship between these 2 gentlemen and the 9 consultants I was working with just got worse and worse and worse, to the point where the last couple weeks I was on this project, every time I would write code for them to, you know, solve a problem that was in the backlog, the following weekend they would rewrite all my code and it wouldn't work. And it was like there was this weird just pride thing that was going on where like they couldn't accept outside help from someone. No matter how nice we were, no matter how helpful, no matter how much we showed them respect. We told them we thought it was really cool that they'd started this company. We just could not earn any respect from these guys, and they just basically looked at it like they knew everything and we knew nothing. And so as a consultant, you can imagine if your job is to try to help other people and your clients basically saying, you're not helping me, everybody on that team was super frustrated. So once I got off that project, one of my coworkers was reading this article about millennials, which these 2 young gentlemen in their 20s that were running this company out of DC, they were both millennials. And this article came to the conclusion that millennials, because they were more entitled, they wouldn't take advice for people as easily. And so everybody kind of circulated this article and everyone was like, oh yeah, that's definitely why these 2 guys wouldn't listen to us. And you know, I thought the article was good, but then when I thought about my own career, you know, I've shared with you in other videos that I was promoted to be an architect when I was 23 years old, and I used to hide certain pieces of my code or just things I was doing from other people that weren't on my team out of fear because I wanted to control the project. And I think these 2 guys, you know, if you think about it, they're both in their early 20s, they start this company, it gets bought out, who knows how much money they're worth at that point. You know, they got a lot of pride in this platform they built, and to be able to bring in outside help and be open and humble with them, you know, they probably had to be at a point in their career where they realized their limitations. And at least when I was in my 20s, I had not really realized a lot of my limitations. So I hope that helped today. It's just another story about a software project from my past. And what I really learned from this one, I think, was just that sometimes you're on a software project and it's miserable. The client isn't really happy with you. They're doing stuff that makes you feel really worthless and like there's not much you can contribute. But at the end of the day, the client paid my company and it really helped them through a tough time. And it was just basically necessary for both parties involved. It just wasn't very fun during the project. But luckily, all software projects do eventually come to an end. So thanks for watching. If you're new to my YouTube channel, consider subscribing, and you can always listen to these instead as a podcast on Google Play, Stitcher, iTunes, or SoundCloud. Just search for Healthy Software Developer and you'll find me there. So until next time, thanks.